Imagine a place where you are told to trust unquestioningly, to follow without ever questioning the authority at the front. A place where power is masked in the guise of spiritual guidance, where obedience is demanded and your voice is silenced. Now, consider this. What happens when the very church you trust most becomes the one that threatens your spiritual freedom? What if the place you turn to for guidance has slowly, over time, turned into the most dangerous space for your soul? Let's explore the chilling truth about the kind of faith that asks you to submit without ever seeking the truth for yourself. It is often said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But we must understand that this is not just the case in governments, corporations, or secular institutions. It is, perhaps, even more dangerous when we consider religious or spiritual authority. A leader within the church, entrusted with the responsibility of guiding souls toward righteousness, can easily become seduced by the very power they wield. It is all too easy to believe that authority over others somehow elevates one's moral or spiritual standing, but the opposite is often true. The more power a leader accumulates, the more distant they can become from the very people they are meant to serve. The most insidious danger of unchecked spiritual authority is that it does not merely corrupt the leader, but also the institution itself. When the leadership is not held accountable, when it is shielded from the same scrutiny to which every other human is subject, the entire structure becomes unbalanced. This unbalance distorts not just the institution, but also the very understanding of faith that the people are meant to carry with them. When power is wielded without accountability, the trust that people place in their leaders becomes a double-edged sword. The more trust is given, the more susceptible the individual becomes to manipulation, and the more dangerous the institution becomes. The irony here is that a religious institution, which should function as a place of refuge, healing, and moral clarity, can become a mechanism of control, power, and exploitation. Leaders who feel insulated by their authority can easily justify their actions, no matter how harmful they may be. They might justify their decisions as being in the service of God's will, or as part of some divine plan that only they have the clarity to understand. The very nature of spiritual leadership allows the leader to position themselves as the sole conduit through which God's will can be perceived, creating a situation where questioning the leader's authority is equated with questioning God himself. Such a dangerous assumption could not be further from the truth. The role of a spiritual leader is not to act as an intermediary between the individual and God, but to guide and empower others to make that connection for themselves. The essence of faith lies not in the hierarchical submission to a human authority, but in the personal, intimate relationship one develops with the divine. Yet when authority is unchecked, this fundamental understanding is lost. Instead of nurturing an individual's growth, the leader often imposes their own narrow interpretations of truth, demanding conformity without room for personal reflection or freedom. Perhaps the greatest danger of all is that once this unaccountable authority takes root, it becomes nearly impossible to see the damage it causes. Those within the institution, both leaders and followers, become so ingrained in the culture of obedience and reverence that they are blinded to the way in which it stifles their own spiritual development. For those who are led by such authority, it can be incredibly difficult to break free from the cycle of control. The very teachings that were meant to liberate them instead become chains, binding them to a system that limits their growth, isolates them from their own moral compass, and entraps them in a false sense of security. But what is most tragic of all is how this unchecked power can poison the very essence of the spiritual journey. Faith is not meant to be a passive acceptance of a leader's words, but an active, ongoing search for truth, for connection, and for understanding. It is meant to be a dynamic process, one that involves questioning, wrestling, and striving for deeper meaning. When the power of spiritual leaders is left unchecked, this quest for truth is replaced by a passive acceptance of whatever the leader deems the truth. Faith becomes less about the journey of self-discovery and more about submitting to someone else's version of reality. The very foundation of what it means to believe is eroded. What we must understand is that spiritual authority should always be tempered by humility. It should never be about the leader's need to be obeyed or revered, but about the leader's capacity to serve, to guide, and to empower others to live authentic lives of faith. True spiritual leaders do not seek to dominate, but to elevate. They do not control, but they help others find their own voice and their own relationship with the divine. This type of leadership does not isolate, it invites. It does not dominate, it liberates. And it is in that liberation that we begin to understand the true nature of faith. Faith is not something that can be dictated from the pulpit or handed down from an authoritative figure. It is something that must be lived, wrestled with, and tested through experience. A leader who understands this will not impose their will, but will encourage others to question, to grow, and to discover for themselves the truth that lies beyond the confines of human interpretation. But to embrace such a freedom requires great courage both from the leader and from the follower. It requires the courage to question, to challenge, and to break free from the systems that seek to control. It requires the courage to stand firm in the belief that one's relationship with the divine is personal, sacred, and not to be manipulated by any human institution. This is not a rejection of authority, but a call to a higher understanding of what true spiritual leadership looks like. The dangerous church, the one that demands obedience above all else, is the one that forgets this fundamental truth. It is the one that elevates human authority to a place where it is no longer questioned, no longer held accountable, and no longer guided by humility. It becomes a place not of spiritual nourishment, but of control. And it is in this environment that the very soul of the individual and the very integrity of the church can be lost. The true power of faith lies not in submission to human authority, but in the liberation that comes when we each take responsibility for our own journey. When we stop blindly following and instead begin to actively seek, challenge, and embrace our own understanding of truth, we begin to experience faith in its fullest form. It is in this freedom from control, freedom from manipulation, freedom from fear, that we find the real power of belief. When we think about the concept of obedience, particularly within the context of a religious institution, we are often confronted with the idea that unquestioning submission is somehow virtuous. It is ingrained in many faith traditions that to be obedient is to be faithful, and to question authority is to display a lack of reverence or humility. This idea, though deeply embedded in our religious understanding, presents a serious dilemma, a dilemma that has the potential to cause great harm to both the individual and the community at large. We must first ask ourselves, what is the cost of blind obedience? What are we sacrificing when we give up the ability to question, to critically engage, or to challenge the very things that are supposed to be leading us toward truth? In many religious communities, especially those that demand a high level of conformity, questioning can be seen as an act of defiance, an act that could even lead to excommunication, exclusion, or spiritual punishment. The individual is expected to submit not only to the teachings but to the very structure of the institution, and in this submission they relinquish their own agency, their ability to think independently, to discern, and to choose. When we do not question, when we stop seeking to understand the why behind the commands or teachings we are given, we begin to lose a sense of our own identity and responsibility in our faith. We begin to treat religion not as a living, evolving journey, but as a set of rigid rules that we must follow without deviation. And this, dear friends, is where the dangers of blind obedience lie. It is in this unquestioning adherence that the very essence of faith is reduced to something mechanical and impersonal. Instead of a dynamic relationship with the divine, it becomes an exercise in submission, one that strips away the individual's capacity for personal growth, reflection, and understanding. Moreover, the dangers of blind obedience are not just philosophical. They are practical and real. History is littered with examples of individuals and groups who followed blindly, only to find themselves led into harm. Religious zealots, under the guise of divine direction, have committed atrocities against their fellow human beings, believing themselves to be acting in accordance with a higher will. The more obedience is demanded, the less room there is for compassion, empathy, and understanding. The more we are asked to submit without question, the more likely we are to overlook the suffering, the harm, and the injustices that may arise from such submission. It is easy, especially in times of uncertainty or fear, to look to someone or something outside ourselves for guidance. We seek certainty in a world that often seems to offer little. The comfort of certainty is alluring, particularly when it comes wrapped in the familiar language of faith and divine purpose. But what is often overlooked is that in seeking this certainty, we may be giving up something even more precious, our own moral judgment. The danger lies not only in following the wrong leader or doctrine, but in losing the very ability to question, to evaluate, and to think for ourselves. This is not to say that authority in and of itself is a bad thing. Authority can be a source of wisdom, a means of providing structure and guidance, but it is essential that this authority is not absolute, not beyond scrutiny. A true spiritual leader, one who is deserving of trust, will encourage dialogue, questioning, and reflection. They will understand that faith is a journey, not a destination, that truth is a living thing, not a static doctrine. It is in the space between question and answer that faith grows, where doubt, when approached with humility and honesty, leads to deeper understanding. When obedience is demanded without room for personal growth or critique, the faith that is being nurtured is not a robust, mature faith, it is a fragile, brittle one. The act of submission, when taken to an extreme, turns faith into a passive experience, a one-sided transaction in which the individual is told what to believe, what to do, and what to think. There is no room for the vibrant exchange that makes faith alive and meaningful. There is no room for the transformation that occurs when one's personal understanding of truth deepens through questioning and exploration. And let us not forget the consequences of this. When we relinquish our ability to think critically, to question the validity of what we are being taught, we risk following paths that are not in line with the very principles we hold dear. We risk being led astray not necessarily by malicious intent, but by the subtle influence of those who, in their own blindness, seek to impose their own understanding of truth on others. The more we submit, the more we lose our ability to discern the difference between what is genuinely good and what is self-serving. In the end, obedience without understanding leads to a stagnant faith, one that does not challenge the individual to grow, but instead holds them in a state of spiritual infancy. A faith that cannot be questioned, a belief that cannot be examined, is not a faith, it is an ideology. It is something that exists outside the realm of the soul, something that is disconnected from the heart and mind. But when faith is allowed to breathe, when the individual is encouraged to engage with it, to wrestle with it, to question it and refine it, the result is a deeper, more authentic connection to the divine. It is in the wrestling, in the questioning, that we find the true essence of faith. Faith is not about blind obedience, it is about trust. Trust that, even in the darkest moments, we can seek the truth, ask the difficult questions, and ultimately find a faith that is our own one, that is forged in the fire of personal discovery, not one that is handed down to us without thought or examination. The danger of blind obedience is not just that it leads us astray, it is that it robs us of our spiritual autonomy, of the very thing that makes us human, the ability to think, to choose, and to grow. In seeking to avoid doubt and discomfort, we lose the richness of a faith that is alive, that is transformative, and that connects us, not just to the divine, but to our own deepest selves. Let us be wary, then, of the cost of submission, and remember that true obedience is not about unquestioning submission to authority, but about the humble willingness to seek truth wherever it may lead. When we consider the relationship between a church and its followers, one of the most insidious aspects often goes unnoticed: the power dynamics that exist between religious leaders and those who place their trust in them. Power, as we know, has the potential to corrupt, and when it is wielded under the banner of sacred authority, it can be especially dangerous. We all know that leadership in any form carries influence, but when that influence is unchallenged, unquestioned, or unquestionable, it becomes a force that can easily manipulate, control, and dominate. There is a certain allure to religious authority. We expect our leaders to be wise, virtuous, and morally upstanding. But with this expectation comes the danger of elevating these figures to a level where they are beyond reproach. The Church, more specifically, the leaders of the Church, becomes a place where unquestioning loyalty and submission are expected. In many instances, this power imbalance is not just accepted, but revered. It is seen as a reflection of divine will, and questioning it can feel almost blasphemous. The problem, of course, is that human beings, even those who are entrusted with spiritual guidance, are still, in the end, human. They are fallible, imperfect creatures. The very system that should be there to nurture and guide can, when misused, lead to exploitation, and because these leaders often operate under the guise of divine mandate, their actions are seen as holy and untouchable. The danger here lies not just in the actions of these individuals, but in the way the institution upholds and justifies their authority. What makes this dynamic even more perilous is that those who are led by these individuals are often not just following their teachings, but are placing their very faith and lives into their hands. The power held by a religious leader is not just psychological, it is spiritual. When someone has the power to dictate not just what you believe, but how you behave, how you pray, how you love, how you live, they have the power to shape not just your actions, but your very identity. This is where the corruption often begins, not in the desire to lead, but in the temptation to control. If we examine the lives of many who have been subjected to manipulative religious leaders, we see a troubling pattern. The more power the leader accumulates, the more isolated and dependent the followers become. When people come to trust their leaders implicitly, when they believe that every word spoken is an infallible truth, they begin to rely on that authority to make decisions for them. Slowly, they lose their own sense of agency. Their personal judgment, their moral compass, and even their spiritual understanding become secondary to the teachings and directions of the leader. The followers are told that to question the leader is to question God, to question the church, and ultimately to question their salvation. Now, this kind of power isn't always exerted with malicious intent, but the consequences can still be disastrous. A leader may genuinely believe they are acting in the best interest of their flock, but when they take it upon themselves to speak for God in a way that leaves no room for disagreement, no space for individual interpretation, they are overstepping the boundaries of their role. They may convince their followers that they alone possess the truth, that the only way to experience salvation, love, or peace is through them, and through them alone. And this creates a dangerous and unhealthy dependency, a dependency that is hard to break once it has been established. The fear of leaving the church or questioning the leader becomes all-consuming. The consequences of not following the leader's teachings are often framed as apocalyptic spiritual damnation, eternal separation from God, the ruin of one's soul. This fear is one of the most potent tools of control, because it preys on one of humanity's deepest anxieties: the fear of being abandoned by God, the fear of being cast out from the community of faith. And it is within this fear that the leader finds their power, as followers become so consumed with the need to please, to conform, and to remain obedient, that they lose sight of the very reason they entered the faith in the first place: to seek truth, to grow, and to deepen their understanding of the divine. Even more troubling is the way this power dynamic can perpetuate itself. Those who are raised within such systems of control often become the next generation of followers. They are taught from an early age that spiritual truth comes from the authority of the leader, and they internalize this belief. In this way, the cycle of control continues generation after generation, with no room for questioning, for freedom of thought, or for personal revelation. What begins as an institution meant to guide and liberate ultimately becomes a cage that traps its followers, keeping them confined within rigid doctrines and harmful practices. And it is not just the followers who suffer in this dynamic. The leaders themselves are often caught in the same trap. The very nature of religious authority, when unchecked, can become corrupting for those who wield it. The more power they accumulate, the more insulated they become from the reality of human suffering, and the less inclined they are to question their own actions. The longer they hold their position, the more they begin to view themselves as above reproach, as infallible, and as an unquestionable source of spiritual guidance. In this way, the leader may become not a shepherd, but a ruler, not a servant of the people, but a master over them. And this is when the true danger emerges, not just for the followers, but for the leader as well, as they become disconnected from the very essence of what it means to lead a spiritual community: humility, service, and a deep, honest connection with those they serve. The real tragedy of all this is that it need not be this way. True spiritual leadership, at its core, is about empowering others to discover and live their truth, not about holding power over them. The most authentic leaders are those who lead with humility, who invite questioning and growth, who create spaces where faith is nurtured through individual experience, not through institutional control. When power is used to control, to isolate, and to dominate, the very essence of faith is lost. It is no longer a means to freedom, but a tool for bondage, And so, when we place our trust blindly in the authority of religious leaders or institutions, we must recognize the risks involved. Power unchecked can corrupt, and power given without question can harm. We must learn to question, to seek truth not just from the institution, but within ourselves, and to recognize that no human being, no matter how pious, is beyond the need for accountability. For it is in that questioning, that searching, that we find not only our own freedom, but the true essence of faith itself. Ultimately, spiritual power is not about control, it is about connection, humility, and the ability to help others discover the divine within themselves. When that balance is lost, the damage is not only to the individual, but to the very spirit of the faith that was meant to nurture and guide them. There is something deeply unsettling about the way we view institutions that we trust the most, especially when those institutions are ones designed to guide us spiritually, to show us the path to a higher purpose. Churches, temples, synagogues, mosques, these sacred spaces are often built upon trust. We trust in the teachings that emerge from them, in the leaders who represent them, and in the systems that have been established over centuries to guide us in our relationship with God. We are taught to place our faith in these institutions, to lean on them in moments of doubt, to look to them for comfort and clarity. But this very trust, while noble in intention, can also be dangerous. When we place too much trust in these institutions, we begin to think of them as infallible, as perfect representations of divine will. We come to believe that because a place of worship is sanctified by tradition, because it holds the name of God, it is inherently safe, that it is beyond reproach, and herein lies the illusion, the belief that because it is sacred, it cannot be corrupted. The irony is that it is precisely the institutions we trust the most that can become the most dangerous. If we are honest, we must admit that history is full of examples where the church, the very place meant to heal and guide, has caused the deepest of wounds. Think of the countless instances where religious authority has been used not to liberate the soul, but to control, to subjugate, to manipulate. Think of the corruption, the abuses, the power dynamics that have been cloaked in the name of faith. And yet, because we trust these institutions so deeply, we often fail to see these faults sometimes until it is far too late. The problem is not necessarily with the structure of these institutions themselves. It is with the way we elevate them, almost to the point of idolatry. When we trust too blindly, when we surrender our critical thinking and personal discernment, we give away our ability to see truth for what it is. We stop questioning, stop challenging, stop engaging in the way that faith should truly encourage us to do. Instead, we follow with unquestioning obedience, and in doing so, we leave ourselves vulnerable to manipulation. We make the mistake of believing that because something is sacred, it must also be immune to human frailty. It's important to remember that these institutions are, at their core, human creations. They are built by people, shaped by the hands of fallible, imperfect beings just like the rest of us. And yet, we tend to forget this. We begin to think that the church, or any place of spiritual significance, is a divine fortress, incapable of error or harm. We place it on a pedestal, and when we do so, we remove the ability to question, to challenge, or even to reconsider. When this happens, we stop using our own judgment, we stop asking the hard questions, and when we stop asking questions, we begin to accept things that may not be right, may not be just, and may not even align with the deeper truths we claim to hold dear. The institution, then, begins to take on an almost absolute power because we no longer see it for what it is, just one avenue, one representation of faith. Instead, we come to believe that it is faith itself. And this is where the danger lies, because once we surrender that critical thinking, that questioning spirit, we allow the institution to shape our world, in ways that may not be aligned with the very principles we think we are upholding. We may find ourselves accepting teachings, practices, and behaviors that are harmful or misguided, simply because they are presented under the guise of spiritual authority. Worse yet, we may convince ourselves that we are doing the right thing, that we are on the path of righteousness, when in fact we are straying further from it. The dangers are not always immediately obvious. They don't always manifest in grand, dramatic ways. Sometimes they creep in quietly, slowly, like a faint whisper in the background. It could be the subtle shift in a leader's rhetoric, or the way a teaching encourages us to place the institution above everything else, including our own conscience. It could be a shift from a focus on spiritual growth and love to one of control and fear. It might even be something as simple as the way we begin to view other people, our fellow human beings, as lesser or unworthy because they do not adhere to the same rigid standards that the institution imposes. These seemingly small shifts can lead us down a very dangerous road, because when we no longer see our faith as something that is meant to bring freedom, to bring liberation of the spirit, we begin to become prisoners within the very institution that was supposed to set us free. We become trapped, not by the divine, but by the institution's hold on our hearts and minds. And once that trust has been misplaced, once it has been used to control and manipulate, it becomes incredibly difficult to break free. But the real tragedy comes when we look around at those who have been harmed by these systems, the ones whose trust was shattered, whose faith was turned into a weapon. And then we see the lasting effects on their lives, the emotional scars, the loss of trust in spiritual matters, the broken relationships, and the disillusionment. All because the trust they placed in a trusted institution was not met with the care, the respect, and the authenticity that they so rightly deserved. This is why we must be vigilant. This is why we must question, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it challenges our deeply held beliefs. This is why we must not allow the illusion of safety in trusted institutions to blind us to the very real dangers that lie beneath. Because faith, true faith, does not require blind obedience. It requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to see beyond the surface, to ask the hard questions, and to search for a truth that is not shaped by the hands of men, but by the Spirit of God itself. The most dangerous church is the one that you trust without question, because it is there within that unquestioning trust that you open yourself to manipulation, harm, and ultimately a loss of the very thing you sought, true connection with the divine.